Hello, everyone. Welcome to this educational program. I am Patricia Vasconcelos, a board member of the Foreign Press Correspondents Association in the US and White House correspondent for SBT Brazilian TV Network. Today, we're going to talk about the role of the European Union in the US and China rivalry, a topic that is present in our daily work, reporters in stories that we write for television, radio, internet, newspaper. Our guest, he's here with us, is Stephen Olson, Senior Research Fellow for Hinrich Foundation. Steve, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. A big thank you to the Foreign Press Correspondents Association for organizing today's event. Now, I have just a couple of slides that I would like to share with you, and I always forewarn, whenever I do this, I manage to screw it up about 50% of the time, so bear with me, and hopefully I will.
Just before we start, Stephen, if you could give me 5 minutes so I can give you, I can introduce you properly for our guests. If you,
sure,
please. If it's okay for you, so we can, if we can just pause the slide a little bit, and so I can properly introduce you for our guests.
Sure.
Many of them. I am sure many of them know you because you are a very important source and interviewee of many TV outlets. So Stephen, he's a senior research fellow at Hinrich Foundation. Over the course of his more than 30-year international career, Olson has lived and worked in Asia, the Middle East, and United States, holding senior executive positions in the private sector, international organizations, government, and academia. He began his career here in Washington, D.C. as U.S. trade negotiator, serving as a member of the U.S. negotiating team during NAFTA and the U.S.-Canada FTA. He went on to serve as president of the Pacific Basin Economic Council in Hong Kong. He after became vice chairman at the Cairo-based Article Group and for Investment and Development. He also had visiting professor positions at various universities. In his current position at Hinrich Foundation, Mr. Olson conducts analysis and research on global trade and investment issues, including U.S.-China relations, the global trade architecture, and sustainable trade. And as I said here at the beginning, we are talking about the role of the European Union in the U.S.-China rivalry. Stephen is going to talk about how renewing a united front with American allies to counter China has been a top priority for the Biden administration. The position Europe takes will determine the effectiveness of any U.S. strategy, but while the U.S. and the European Union have had close working partnership, their interests and viewpoints are far from identical, right? So during this educational program, we will review, we are going to analyze and decode perspectives and priorities of the European Union and the U.S. toward China in terms of how to manage the rise of this country. So Stephen is going to start with his presentation, and for our guests who are already connected here with us after this presentation, we're going to open for a section of questions and answers. So all of you who are here with us in this live connection, you could drop your questions through the question box so I can forward those questions to Stephen. So welcome again, and feel free to start your presentation, Stephen. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Patricia. Every time I hear someone make reference to a 30-year career, it reminds me that I'm getting very, very old. So
no, none of us. We gain experience. I must point out, I cannot forget, Stephen, that this program is organized by the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the United States with the Hinrich Foundation, and the association is solely responsible for the development of the content of this educational program. So let's start.
Great, very good. Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us on behalf of the Hinrich Foundation. So as we discussed, we're going to be talking a little bit about the role, in my judgment, a potentially substantial role that the EU could be playing in the U.S.-China rivalry. Now, of course, President Biden came into office seeking to restore traditional U.S. alliances and confront China more forcefully on strategic, economic, and trade issues. This came, of course, on the heels of 4 years of the Trump administration, in which President Trump sometimes seemed determined to take a wrecking ball to traditional U.S. alliances, in particular with the EU. Some of you will probably remember that Trump even went so far as to refer to the EU as, quote unquote, just as bad as China when it came to trade practices. And so a top priority for the Biden administration, literally from day one, has been to repair these damaged alliances, in particular with the EU, and construct a more united front to push back more effectively in areas of common concern with China, economically, strategically, and on the trade front. Now, thus far, I would say the results of that effort to repair our relationships and to form a united front has been mixed at best, and it's not really clear to me when or if we might see a significant improvement. Now, I think the focus on the EU is just a sensible recognition of the critical balancing role that the European Union plays. An EU that lines up more directly behind some of the more aggressive, forceful U.S. policies would certainly strengthen the punch that those policies pack. Whereas an EU that sits on the fence, or even more so, an EU that tilts in the direction towards China, would significantly strengthen the ability of China to weather the storm with the various policies, restrictions, sanctions, etc. And so I think we're in a somewhat ironic situation in which the most important rivalry taking place in the Indo-Pacific region could be significantly impacted by decisions that are being taken in Brussels. Now, of course, Europe and the United States and most of the countries of Western Europe and then subsequently the European Union have enjoyed a close working partnership for the most part, for the better part of 3/4 of a century now. But the interests and viewpoints on China are certainly not identical. Yes, of course, the US and the EU share a common set of concerns about China's authoritarian system of government, its military muscle flexing in the South China Sea, and some of its more predatory trade and economic policies, and human rights concerns as well. But despite those differences, despite those similarities, there are significant differences over how best to manage China's rise. Now, the European Union, it seems to me, is trying to thread a fairly narrow needle. It's trying to maintain robust commercial relationships, strong trade and investment ties with China, while still reserving the right to push back and sometimes push back fairly aggressively when there are concerns about human rights, strategic issues, or trade and economic issues. The United States, and I think for those of you who are based in Washington, you've got a front row seat for this. I think the consensus now in the US sort of assumes the inevitability of a greater disruption in the commercial relationship. It seems like the US is no longer using the term decoupling, opting instead to adopt the term de-risking. But I think really they refer to basically the same thing. Now, this whole discussion is further complicated by the difficulty we have when we even attempt to talk about a quote unquote European Union viewpoint on China. Because there are some fairly divergent voices within the EU. At one end of the extreme, we've got French President Emmanuel Macron, who has been the strongest voice against the EU following behind some of the more aggressive, some of the more confrontational US policy stances. And Macron has even gone so far as to say that lining up behind the US on these policies would turn the EU into, quote unquote, a vassal state of the United States. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got people like European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and her rhetoric, and in particular, some of her more recent speeches, have been very blunt and very direct in talking about the sharp deterioration in EU-China relations and calling out in, again, fairly blunt language, some of the more problematic Chinese policies. Now, this critical balancing role that the European Union can play, not surprisingly, that important role is clearly recognized by officials in Beijing. And so Beijing has been pursuing a policy that makes a fair amount of sense, which is triangulation, attempting to the extent possible to split the European Union off from the United States. And so China has made substantial efforts to cultivate stronger ties with the European Union. Now, in my opinion, the high watermark for these efforts occurred during the waning days of the Trump administration, in which China and the EU reached agreement on what really would have been a landmark comprehensive agreement on investment. Now, at the time the agreement was reached, the election in the US was over. Biden had been elected president, but he had not yet taken office. And so all of his administration in waiting, the officials who were going to move into senior positions in the Biden administration once they were sworn in, all reached out sort of frantically to their European counterparts. And they said, look, we've got real concerns about this agreement with China. Please wait, please wait, please wait. Let us officially come into office, and we can convey these concerns to you through official channels. The European Union and European officials heard these concerns and said, no, we're going to move forward with this agreement with China. Now, at the time, this was seen, and I believe correctly seen, as a major coup, a major victory for China in its efforts to sort of triangulate between the US and the EU, and a major setback for the United States. However, the agreement actually hasn't come into force as a result of significant acrimony, which ensued between China and the European Union over sanctions over human rights concerns about in Xinjiang. So the agreement for the time being has never been fully ratified. It's sort of on a side burner in a state of apparently permanent limbo, and it is presumed dead. Now, an even greater impediment to a closer relationship between China and the EU has been the war in Ukraine. Now, from the European Union perspective, the war is absolutely cataclysmic. It's an existential threat. It's viewed as a threat to the very foundational principles upon which the entire European Union experiment has been based. And so from the perspective in Brussels, the only appropriate reaction to the war in Ukraine is strong condemnation of Russia, strong sanctions on Russia, and support for Ukraine. Now, of course, China has done none of this. And not only have they not joined the sanctions, they've not only not criticized Russia, they've also expressed the point of view that responsibility for the war lies with the United States rather than Russia. And in fact, China has significantly increased its imports from Russia of energy and other items, which would either directly or indirectly help fuel the ability of Russia to fight the war in Ukraine. And so again, the EC President Ursula von der Leyen has again, in very blunt terms, said, look, the EU-China relationship is going to be very largely determined by how China responds to what she refers to as Putin's illegal war in Ukraine. Now, if that's the case, that would suggest to us that relations between China and the EU are going to be at least somewhat strained for the foreseeable future. Now, if China has not been playing its cards perfectly vis-a-vis the European Union, I think it's fair to say that the United States has not helped its case either. The US has not been playing its cards perfectly by any stretch of the imagination. The European Union has been rankled by what it sees as a lack of coordination and a lack of consultation from the United States, and a seeming indifference to the collateral damage that many of the US's China policies are causing for the European Union. Now, the case in point for this, of course, is the Inflation Reduction Act, which was intended to, among other things, help the United States compete more effectively vis-a-vis China in electric vehicles and electric vehicle batteries. And one of the key components of this legislation provides for significant tax incentives for vehicles or batteries that are assembled either in the United States or, importantly, in countries that have a free trade agreement with the United States. Now, of course, the European Union does not have a free trade agreement with the United States. So this means that as a practical matter, European producers would be disadvantaged not only vis-a-vis US producers, but also vis-a-vis Korean producers, Mexican producers, Canadian producers, producers from any country that has a free trade agreement with the United States. Now, in my opinion, it should have been blindingly obvious to US officials that this was going to cause an absolute firestorm in the European Union. But both Congress and the White House either didn't recognize it or didn't particularly care. And so when the legislation was finalized and when European officials became aware of these provisions, they predictably went ballistic. They went through the roof. And so there's been a tremendous amount of scrambling around after the fact damage control to try to patch things up. Now, it looks like they'll have sort of a Band-Aid solution, either as a result of reaching an agreement in critical minerals between the United States and the European Union, which would very generously be considered a free trade agreement and let them get access to the tax incentives in that way, or through an implementing regulation which would allow leased vehicles from the European Union to also qualify for the tax break. But I think irrespective of that, the key takeaway here from the European Union is that this would not strengthen your confidence in your working relationship with the United States when it comes to China policy. So can and will the US and the EU ever get their act together with regard to China policy? Well, I don't think we will ever see a seamless policy. There never has been and there never will be a seamless US-EU China policy. But I guess the real question is, are we going to see a greater convergence or divergence in the US and the EU approach to China? I would suggest to you that you might see somewhat of a bifurcated response. I think you might see a coming together rhetorically, and I think in the G7 statement you saw a fair amount of unity rhetorically, but I would encourage you to pay less attention to what is said and what is written down on a piece of paper and pay more attention to what actually happens. Because when it comes time to implement many of these quote unquote unified policies, I think there still might be a fair amount of divergence. In any case, we'll see how that plays out. I think though that if for no other reason than to limit the collateral damage, I think there's a strong rationale here for both sides to coordinate and to consult more closely. I'll bring my comments to a close there, and I'll look forward to any comments or any questions that any of you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to again ask our guests, please feel free to drop your questions or send your questions so Stephen can help us with that. So, Stephen, you wrote in your analysis and you briefly talked about here that you said that repairing bruised relations with the European Union to push back more vigorously against China has been a priority for the Biden administration. Xi Jinping has been also very focused in reconstruct those bruised relations you mentioned here in your introduction, the visit that Macron did to Beijing with Ursula von der Leyen. Also, they were together not long time ago. Ukraine was part of the agenda of that visit that Macron made, but also balancing business ties as well. In this world economic chess game, who is ahead, United States or China?
Well, look, in terms of the struggle to kind of get the European Union to tilt in one direction or another, I think the game has just begun. I think there are some. I would not, however, underestimate the impact of China's stance on the war in Ukraine. I think that is a very significant impediment. And as long as the war drags on, and as long as China continues to maintain its stance, I think that's going to be a very significant impediment to a closer relationship between the EU and China.
Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, the war in Ukraine, do you believe that in any point, in any extension, this war and the way that United States it's referring itself and European Union as well, this might affect in some point the mutual interest of United States and Europe? Do you believe that there might be a break at some point so that the European Union can clearly pursue the Chinese market?
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the upcoming U.S. election, both in terms of the presidential election and Congress. As those of you who are in Washington or probably know much better than I do, there have been a number of voices in Congress, primarily but not entirely on the Republican side of the aisle, that are voicing some very serious reservations about the commitment to Ukraine, and in particular, the amount of money that the United States is spending supplying Ukraine. If there is a change in the direction the political winds are blowing in the United States, and there's a ramp down in the U.S. commitment to supporting Ukraine in this conflict, I think that could spill over into the U.S.-EU relationship, because again, and those of you who are European and work for European news outlets, again, you'll know this better than I. From the European perspective, this is viewed as nothing other. The war in Ukraine is viewed as nothing other than an existential threat requiring maximum support for Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. As you referred to the U.S. election, someone asked, as the House just passed the tablet limit bill this agreement between Biden and Kevin McCarthy, some cuts regarding how the United States, how the government is going to spend its money. So could you address more about how the new policy of this U.S. administration might change regarding this new reality, regarding its internal economy and the war in Ukraine, how much money they're putting there?
I think a lot of it depends on, well, let me say this. My understanding is of the agreement that was reached between Biden and House Speaker McCarthy is that there will continue to be increases for defense funding presumably that means there'd still be the money available to support the war effort in Ukraine. Now, the fact that the money is at least potentially there does not mean that necessarily the political will also be there. And particularly if we see in the upcoming election Republicans gaining control of both houses of Congress, let alone the White House.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that the Biden administration can change some policies in the course of the Biden's campaign for the re-election, and this something that might affect the relation with the European Union? Or it's too soon to project that or predict that?
Well, I'll answer the question by expressing a hope. I would hope that one takeaway for the Biden administration would be that a bit of additional consultation goes a very long way. I mean, this major blow up we had over the Inflation Reduction Act, from my point of view, was entirely a self-inflicted wound. I was shocked that this wasn't foreseen, the problem that this created, and the damage that it potentially could do to the confidence of the EU in their ability to work constructively with the Biden administration. I'll add two additional thoughts. I think also that there are a lot of people in the European Union that are watching the polls, even though we're still 2 years out from the next presidential election. They're keeping their eyes on the polls, and they're seeing that Donald Trump continues to have a substantial lead on the Republican nomination. And so I think there's got to be at least some tendency to worry about, we have a very clear picture of the stance that President Trump during his previous administration took towards the European Union. And if there's a possibility that we could end up with another 4 years of Trump, I think that could also be influencing how at least some in the European Union are viewing their cooperation with the United States.
Mm-hmm. A question here about South Korea. The South Korean president, he was here in Washington, D.C. in a state visit not long time ago. He spent a full day with President Biden at the White House, including a state dinner at the end of that day. Can South Korea be an option in order to decrease American and European dependence on Chinese products?
Well, I'd say a couple of things about Korea. Korea, I think, is a very interesting case, and in a lot of respects, in a very similar situation to the European Union. There are very, very, very strong economic ties between China and Korea, but yet a very, very strong strategic and security relationship. And so I think Korean politicians are playing a very delicate balancing act to try to maintain the very cooperative relationship with the United States, both on a security and economic basis, without doing anything to jeopardize the relationship with China. In terms of Korea ever being able to sort of replace the European Union in terms of the economic relationship with the United States, I don't think under any case, even under the case, I don't think there's any set of circumstance in which we'll see a dramatic rollback in the U.S.-European Union economic relationship. I think that's steady. I think that's secure. And even if the two countries do not, if both the United States and the European Union do not see eye to eye on a more unified China policy, I don't see that impacting or decreasing the strong economic and trade relationship and the high degree of integration that exists between the U.S. and the EU.
Mm-hmm. Well, in this educational program, we are focusing on the United States and Europe and how this relation can affect both relations with China. But there are also other, elements and players in the world. BRICS, for example, China, Brazil, India, South Africa, and Russia, right? Countries part of this group, as Brazil, for example, showed huge interest in repair broken relations with China. The Brazilian president, just after Macron, he also visited Beijing, showing a strong interest from both the South American country and also from the Chinese country. What are the implications from your perspective to the US and Europe regarding this approach of China toward South America, called by Xi Jinping as a new era? I'm saying that because I was there in that coverage, and while both presidents, they were walking, the Chinese government chose a Brazilian music called a New Era while they were walking. So what might be the implications for United States and Europe?
I think the visit was extremely important. It highlighted the fact that although from the US and the European Union perspective, the war in Ukraine is an immensely high priority and requires a very strong response. But we see a lot of countries, and in particular, you mentioned the BRICS, Brazil, India. Other countries are being much more agnostic. Other countries are being much more neutral in the conflict, and even get a little bit indignant at the suggestion that it should be as important to them as it is to the European Union. I forget who it is. It might have been someone in Brazil, it might have been somebody in South Africa, but a line that has been uttered many, many times is that the European Union thinks that European problems are global problems, but that global problems are not the European Union's problems. And I think there's been this schism where a lot of countries, the BRICS countries in particular, feel that there's insufficient attention on the problems directly impacting them, but an assumption that there's got to be a great degree of interest in a war taking place in Europe. So I think China has an opportunity to sort of play into this dissatisfaction in Brazil and other countries that share a similar viewpoint and don't view the war in Ukraine as an existential crisis to the same extent that the European Union does. So I think the Lula visit was very significant.
Mm-hmm. So we should not see as a threat or a clear division among, regions in the world. Oh, now China, they are facing Latin America or maybe India. So can all those forces, economic agreements coexist in a healthy way?
Well, here's what I would say. I think most countries in the world don't wish to get dragged into this strategic rivalry between the United States and China. They assess, and in most cases, I think correctly so, that their national best interests are served by maintaining robust commercial ties, both with the United States and China, and avoiding any kind of a tilt one way or the other. And so I think we are seeing a large group of countries trying to remain in that middle ground as the U.S.-China rivalry intensifies, despite the efforts of the United States to get more countries to tilt in its direction, and despite the efforts of China to get more countries to tilt in their directions. For most of these countries, and I think it's especially true in ASEAN, I think this plays out in particular in ASEAN, their best interests are maintained by avoiding a definitive tilt and maintaining robust ties with both the US and China.
Mm-hmm. Focusing in the European Union itself, you talked here at the beginning about the divergent voices within the European Union, and you mentioned the Macron visit and the Ursula von Leyen as well visit. But could you give us other examples that might explain this concept of divergent voices within the European Union?
There's a couple of important countries I think we have to keep our eye on. Germany is one of those. Now, of course, Angela Merkel, at least in perception, put business first in the relationship with China, often to the frustration of the United States. Particularly the German automotive industry, derives a very significant portion of their global revenues and profits from China. And Angela Merkel put a high priority on maintaining close ties, not rocking the boat with China in deference to the strong commercial ties that so many German companies have. Now, her successor, Olaf Scholz, I don't quite have a handle yet, personally, on where he's coming from. He sometimes seems to engage in rhetoric that suggests a more harder line stance and a bit of a divergence from the policies of Angela Merkel, his predecessor. Yet there are some decisions that are being taken, particularly with leasing of some port facilities that seem more in line. So I personally do not have a clear take on the extent to which Germany is going to, and under Olaf Scholz, will follow that more business first attitude that Angela Merkel took, or whether we'll see sort of a tougher stance out of Germany. The other country that's interesting to keep an eye on, I think, will be Italy. Italy was the only G7 member to sign on for the Belt and Road Initiative. Now the current administration seems to be reviewing whether or not they want to continue with that, or whether or not they want to pull out. I think that will be an important bellwether to keep an eye on to see which way Italy might tilt.
Mm-hmm. The war in Ukraine, it's a topic which a huge interest. How big is the patience among European Union countries toward China, who promote itself saying that it's neutral in the conflict, although, as you mentioned here, showed an inclination toward Moscow, right? How far do you believe it can go, this diplomatic relation among European Union countries and China, while saying, no, let's wait, Xi Jinping, he's neutral in this conflict? Or how far this can go, this diplomatic acceptance of this speech of neutrality?
Yes. Well, look, I think, at least in terms of the realists in the European Union, I don't think anyone is realistically expecting a significant change in policy on the part of China. After making their stance so clear, I don't think there should be any realistic expectations that China's stance is going to change and that it's going to start coming down harder on Russia. I think the hope, at least among some in the European Union, and I suspect this is probably the case with President Macron, is that China can somehow play a constructive role in bringing the war to an end. I think if China can do that, I think that will provide diplomatic coverage for many in the European Union to maintain, robust and constructive commercial ties. But I don't think anyone's realistically expecting China to adopt a position more in line with the European Union position on the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned here that the U.S. has not helped its case. U.S. has not helped its case regarding this whole situation, and also mentioned the G7 meeting, saying that we should pay more attention with journalists and society in actions rather than what they signed there in those meetings. But do you see any progress that was achieved in that meeting, the G7, that you could highlight regarding U.S. and European Union trade relations?
Yeah, yes, I do. I think if there's one specific outcome from the G7 meeting that I think has at least the potential to be one area of sort of concrete achievement, will be the efforts to work together more closely on economic coercion. Economic coercion takes place when Although China was not specifically referenced by name, the language in the G7 communique was clearly targeted at China and China's propensity to engage in economic coercion. So, for example, when Australia had the audacity, had the temerity to suggest that it would be useful to find out what the origins of COVID were, China responded by taking a number of trade actions against Australia. So there've been historically cases where when a country takes a move that is not that's geopolitically displeases China, that China frequently responds with various trade and economic sanctions, otherwise known as economic coercion. Now, the U.S. and the European Union view on this, I think, is fairly similar, which is when countries are subjected to this form of economic coercion, we have to try to help them weather the storm. So again, an example, if there was a more coordinated response to economic coercion in place when Australia got hit by the sanctions, hypothetically, you'd see something like this play out. Australia has a very robust wine industry, as many of you know, and China had been a leading wine export market for those Australian wine producers. And then as a result of the sanctions and the tariffs that were put in place, Australian exports dropped off dramatically, causing a lot of pain and suffering for the Australian wine industry. If there had been a more coordinated response mechanism in place at that time, the United States, the European Union could have made a concerted effort to purchase more of that Australian wine and thereby limit the economic harm and strengthen the ability of the country that's being subjected to the economic coercion to weather the storm. If there's one outcome from the G7 that I think probably has the best prospects to really produce some tangible work, I think it's the pledges to work together on economic coercion.
Oh, so it's accurate to say that United States, European Union, they agree that economic coercion work or might work globally. No, we are not talking only about China. So is it accurate to say that?
Yeah. So to be clear, this was not targeted to China. It was referenced generically, although reading between the lines, we understand that both the EU and US officials have been strongly critical of China for those instances in which China has engaged in economic coercion.
Okay, Stephen, we're driving toward to the end of this program. I have here a question I think that might close our discussion. It's a question that you also pointed out, but if you could address this for us at the end, do you believe that can United States and European Union get their act together?
Here's what I'd say. In terms of an absolutely seamless policy, no, I don't think so. I think you will see, at least initially, a rhetorical convergence, a reflection of being united in terms of what their objectives are. But when it comes to operationalizing a lot of these agreements, it's going to be the devil always lies in the details. Both the European Union and the United States are in agreement that they need to de-risk, and that's understood to mean to engage less in critical supply chains that are based in China. But in terms of how that actually happens, there's going to be a lot of disagreements. The devil always lies in the details. So I think—
Can you develop more about this concept? I'm very curious about when you say that the devil always lies. You're not thinking of course, one particular country, but if you could give an example that wouldn't harm anyone.
Sure. So look, it's very easy at the level of presidents and prime ministers to say that we're in full agreement. We need to de-risk our trade in strategic materials and strategic products. Okay, fine. Complete agreement, complete unity, complete convergence on that. Okay, But then when you operationalize it is where you see the disagreements. So what exactly is a strategic material? You want to restrict trade in some semiconductors, but not other semiconductors. And one party says, well, we think here's our list of what we consider to be strategic materials or strategic products that we need to de-risk. And other countries are going to have different viewpoints and say, no, we disagree. We don't think this product, or that product should be included. And so it's relatively easy at the level of prime minister and president to have this nice sounding unified position on the need to de-risk in critical materials and critical products, but you can still run into a lot of disagreements over precisely which products are critical, which are strategic, and which are not.
No, and a question here that appeared, we spoke about this, I believe, in another moment, the WTO, right? And you mentioned once that the way that the world is doing its business changed completely, and the role of the World Trade Organization, it's not as important, or it's not behaving, or the action, it's not the way that it should be. So in this perspective of this balance among United States and European Union, are they playing an accurate role in order to make the WTO useful?
It's an interesting and an important question. I think there's a somewhat different viewpoint between the United States and the EU on the role of the WTO, and that is further complicating the establishment of this united front, this potential united front. The European Union seems to be more committed to saying, hey, let's try to find a way to make the WTO work. We know there are problems, we know there are challenges, but let's really roll up our sleeves, get in there. We still think the WTO can play a critical role. Let's work together to solve these problems. To one degree or another, and the US policy seems to suggest that they've accepted that the WTO is more in the background, at least for the foreseeable future. They're still, the US will continue to be engaged in efforts to reform the WTO, but the United States seems to be proceeding, despite its rhetoric, where it reiterates the importance of the WTO, its policies seem to suggest that it's accepted that the WTO is going to be more in the background and play less of a relevant role, whereas the European Union seems determined to help ensure that the WTO is really front and center in resolving some of these issues. I think this difference in viewpoint between the US and the EU over the role or the potential role of the WTO is part of the reason we're seeing some difficulty in forming this united front.
Some of our viewers, journalists here watching us, they want to develop more this story. For example, I think it should be helpful, for example, to how can we explain, or for which reason United States might want to leave the WTO in this background? And is this a matter of in a specific administration, or this was happening during the previous administration as well? Is it something recent, and why is this happening?
Well, look, let's first be clear that the United States was the driving force behind the establishment of the WTO and has historically been one of the strongest supporters and advocates. I think where we are now reflects a conclusion that many people regret, that the WTO is just no longer fit for purpose, that its rule book is hopelessly out of date. And because the WTO operates on a consensus basis, where you need 164 out of 164 members to really take any kind of significant decisions, I don't think there's much hope that the WTO can move quickly enough or be reformed quickly enough to be a key player in solving some of the challenges that we're facing today and that we're facing for the foreseeable future. I think from the point of view of most trade officials, most policy officials in the United States, they're not happy about this. I think I think they regret it, but I think there's a recognition that while the U.S. will remain engaged in efforts to reform and repair the WTO, that they've got to proceed on a basis outside of WTO channels to address the very real issues that we've got to confront today, because the WTO just won't move fast enough, and the WTO reform process just won't move fast enough.
Mm-hmm. If you have time, just for another question here, from your perspective, who is the main ally of Xi Jinping today in the Western world?
In the Western world, it's a really interesting question. Look, I think after
this reality does not exist.
Well, I think the word ally might be a little bit too strong. I think in particular after his recent visit to China, I think within the European Union, I think Francois, the way I would phrase it is, I'm not sure if I would use the word ally, but I think the key power broker, the key influential figure within the European Union, who is most likely to advocate for policies that would align with China's interests, I would say would probably be President Macron.
Okay, and now looking in that region, can we use the word ally to say who is more aligned with Xi Jinping in his region in order to help his interests, his economic interests?
Well, look, I think if you look at all of ASEAN as a region, China long ago displaced the United States as the most important trade, commercial, investment partner in the region. So I think, despite some fairly nettlesome, outstanding boundary disputes, I think the ASEAN region as a whole recognizes the economic importance of China. The comment I hear again and again when I talk to officials out here is, China isn't going anywhere. China is a fact of life, and we've got to deal with China. So I think there's a strong recognition of that in ASEAN, and I think their policies reflect that.
Mm-hmm. And how important or how strong is the topic of technology and spies, that this topic that involves a lot of reports that we write about, about the spies balloons here in United States, this country considering to ban TikTok, that it was banned in the cell phones from people that work for the government, but not in the whole country. But this is a topic that it's still going on here in United States. How can this affect U.S. trade relations with China, and if this affects European Union as well?
It would be hard to put your finger on a single issue that's probably going to be more important in the trade and economic relationship. Mm-hmm. We're living in an era of technological advances in which the number of products which have dual use capabilities, products that can be used either for consumer use or can be used for military or other strategic purposes, is growing seemingly day by day. That reality creates either the rationale or the pretext for additional levels of export restrictions. So I think this is an important area. It's going to grow in importance. And again, it's an area where we could see some divisions of viewpoint between the US and the European Union on how what products these restrictions should be placed on, and how strenuous and how onerous these restrictions should be. The U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, in a speech I'm sure all of you followed closely a few weeks ago, referred to, in terms of these technology restrictions, referred to the need to keep a small yard with a very high fence in terms of these technology products that you're trying to keep out of China's hands. Now, that's a very useful analogy because there are going to be a lot of disagreements between the United States and the European Union over exactly how big or small that yard should be and exactly how high or low that fence should be.
Do you see European Union countries as much concerned as United States regarding technological insecurity, concerns about data, and those concerns always they are involved regarding apps or companies that comes from China? So do you see European Union countries as much concerned as United States regarding products that comes from China?
I think there is a similar level of concern, but whether or not the concern within the European Union rises completely to the level in the United States, I'm not sure. The United States is in a fairly unique position here as sort of the sole remaining superpower and an Asia Pacific nation. So I think the perspective in the European Union and the perspective in the United States is always going to be is always going to be a little bit different for those reasons.
You think can this be solved among United States and China directly? What it seems like it's a crossfire of accusations, right? This country accusing U.S. Companies of spying or using tools and apps in order to reach data from citizens and occasionally data from U.S. government institutions. Can this be solved from your perspective in a not diplomatic way, but in a political level, talking about this in a more broader level?
Well, I think you used the right phrase. I think it is kind of a crossfire of accusations. In terms of whether or not they can work it out, that I'm not sure about, but they've got an obligation to the citizens of their own countries and the citizens of countries around the world to try to find, they're never going to reach 100% agreement, and they're never going to see things completely eye to eye. I think the obligation they have to themselves and others is to establish some type of a workable modus vivendi, some type of a framework where they can cooperate and where they can ensure that disagreements don't blow up out of proportion. I think at a minimum, they have an obligation to try to establish that type of a framework, that type of a modus vivendi to better manage these issues. And as the Biden administration says frequently, to put some guardrails into the relationship.
Okay, Stephen Olson, thank you so much. Anything you'd like to add? Any tip or any idea for our guests? We have so many reporters also watching us, and they would be pleased if you could add something. I don't know, an idea for a story that we could develop from here. That everything that we spoke about, so many topics.
Well, look, here's what I would say. Well, first of all, a big thank you, both to the Foreign Press Correspondents Association and to all the people who've joined us. I'd say, look, please don't regard this as a one-off. Use me as a resource. Feel free to stay in touch with me, connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, all of that stuff. And if you want to, certainly come to me if you have specific questions, but even if you just want to kick around some story ideas, I'm very happy, very amenable to doing so. And we can talk on the record, off the record, whatever the case might be. So please take advantage. I'm here. I view a big part of my job as engaging with the media. So a very sincere invitation, and I hope you all take me up on that.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen Olson, Senior Research Fellow of Hinrich Foundation. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. We spoke here in this educational program about the role of the European Union in the US-China rivalry. This program is organized by the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the United States in partnership with the Hinrich Foundation. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.